I'm really looking forward to this keynote with Catherine Cronin. I don't know if any of you have seen her. She's been around yesterday and today at least. And I'm very happy to have her with us today. I'll be very quick with my intro. Catherine is an independent scholar and her work focuses on critical and social justice approaches in digital open education. She's currently a GoGN Fellow, which is a network of open education. And she's currently co-editor of Higher Education for Good, Teaching and Learning Futures. I'm going to put this is a really awesome book, hopefully coming out soon. And I think we all need this kind of work. And Catherine is someone who I've known and followed on Twitter for a long time and worked with very closely. And she's one of the people who has both the big picture thinking and the detail thinking at the same time, which is very rare. She's also someone who understands the very STEM field and the very humanities and social science fields. And she has worked in something which I consider, sort of similar to AMICAL. She's worked at the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education in Ireland. So she's had this work of working across institutions that have very different sizes and contexts. And so I'm really looking forward to what she has to say today and her expertise in digital and open education. And I'm really looking forward to the session and the workshop afterwards. Take it away, Catherine.
That's very kind, Maha. Thank you so much. And thank you, Jeff and Alex. And thank you all for being here. Delighted to join you. As Maha mentioned, I was able to participate in the conference a little bit on each of the 3 days so far. And as I was saying before we started, there's a great sense of the buzz and the joy, I think, in this networking that you do as part of AMICAL. So I'm really happy to be a part of it just in a little bit today. I'm going to share my screen at this stage. Let's see if I can do this. Okay. And great. Can you see that?
Looks great.
Okay, that's wonderful. And I'm just going to get the chat up so that I can see. Try and keep an eye on that as I'm going along this morning. So as you can see, I had a conversation with the conference organizers about this topic and the presentation this morning and the workshop. So as you can see, it's called Critical Digital Literacies, Developing Agency and Sustaining Hope in Troubled Times. And these are all things I expect that many of you have been thinking about of late. The two cover images there are from something called the Fem Ed Tech Quilt for Care and Justice in Open Education. I encourage you to check out the link if you'd like. It was a global project that was assembled about 2 years ago. And the squares on the left are made by 11 people who work in open education at the University of Cape Town, and it's word open in several different African languages. And the image on the right is a bird symbolizing hope from Viv Rolfe, an educator in the UK. These slides are open, and I'm just going to share the link here now. Maha, I think is going to share that in the chat as well. These are openly licensed, so if you want to look at the slides either now or after, there's a link. Every single resource that I mention or image there's a link in the slides so that you can dig into anything that interests you. And what I didn't say in the title, and I suppose is worth saying, is that I work, as Maha said, in higher education here in Ireland. I'm originally from the US, but I've been in Ireland for about half my life at this stage. I've made my home here. So, and I don't presume to speak globally. So my keynote draws on the work of the National Forum, where I worked until recently, and scholars and practitioners here in Ireland, but also globally. And I really welcome your thoughts and ideas, and maybe how the ideas that I share this morning resonate and relate in your context. So please use the chat. I will do my best to keep an eye on it as we go. At our first meeting about the conference, Alex shared this map, so I've adapted it slightly. And there's a green dot on here, which is me. So this is the little patch of the world, I suppose, where we all are. And that's me on the west coast of Ireland. And it's wonderful to all join in this space. But as Leslie Gourlay and many other scholars have written, even when we're online, we're embodied. We're in our wherever we are, our messy realities. I took this picture just a few minutes before we started. This is the view from where I'm sitting right now. It's a cloudy day in Ireland. This is what's considered summertime in Ireland, typical summer's day. So I hope wherever you're sitting, you are comfortable, have a cup of tea or coffee or whatever you like, and look forward to the next 40 minutes or so. So if you'd like to put 1 or 2 words in the chat, I'd love to just hear how you're feeling on the last day of this wonderful conference, how you're feeling today. Demetrius, you love the west coast of Ireland. Thank you for saying that. It isn't always the best weather, but it's a lovely place. Inspired, Jeff, indeed. Some more inspiration. Lovely, Eleonora. Great. Connected, looking forward to it, warm and fuzzy, good vibrations. Oh, that's lovely. Yeah, well, whatever you've all been doing for the last 2 days, you've obviously been doing something right, because it seems like many people are in a good place. Lovely to hear all this. Motivated, sunny and cool. Thanks, Helen. Motivated. Okay. All right, I'll get started then, and thank you for that. And please continue to write in the chat. As I said, I'll try and keep an eye on it. As I know many speakers have already done, I just think we can't really embark on talking about anything related to digital and higher education without acknowledging the context that we're all in. This is really not just the context for our work in higher education, but our personal lives, everything around us. And this isn't meant to be a complete list, but just an acknowledgement of these challenging and indeed times of crisis. So of course, we're still experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate and environmental crisis, austerity, deepening inequalities, which are, of course, both multiple and intersecting, datafication, which I'll talk about a good bit more today, and surveillance capitalism, rising authoritarianism, reasonable expectations of ongoing instability around many of these, and of course, beyond all of those, multiple challenges and tensions specific to and within higher education itself. So I'd like to just share with you a metaphor that's been really useful and inspiring for me in the last year or so. And it's a concept called the after times. And it's by Eddie Glaude, who wrote a remarkable book about the writings of James Baldwin, published in 2020. And he uses this concept of the after times as an interregnum, a time, disruption and splintering of the old ways, where we see what was before and something new is coming into view. And the term was originally coined by the poet Walt Whitman in the post-Civil War Reconstruction period in the US, which was a moment, of course, of profound moral reckoning. And as Eddie Glaude says, great hopes dashed. Another after times and times of moral reckoning in the US was after the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Glaude writes about this as well, when again, the nation was poised to change, but there was grief and trauma as many turned away from genuine change. And so perhaps in your own context, in your own countries, you can think of specific times of these moral reckonings, even recently. So Baldwin wrote in that time of the 60s, and he wrote about the fact that these moments are indeed a discontinuity and a chance to grasp a new way of being in the world, but it rests on what we do in the moment. And Eddie Glaude thinks that this time of crisis that we're going through is another after times, and that it's useful and indeed empowering to think that we can refuse to accommodate and adjust to the status quo. And Glaude uses this lovely phrase, we can stand askance to the way things are. So Eddie Glaude looks to Baldwin, and particularly his later work, which isn't always his most valued work, but how it speaks to recognizing the time and the energy and the courage to keep fighting for justice. So for me, a lot of these things are indeed the values of education as well. So I just share this analysis as an example of the kind of work that can inspire us and guide us, and certainly has done so for me. And I'll return to it at the end. So probably the way that most of us would relate to the concept of the after times is in relation to COVID. So, during the COVID lockdowns and campus closures, of course, teaching and learning and support and leadership in higher education continued. But that time also exposed multiple forms of inequality and in many cases exacerbated them. So this notion of digital and social inequality mutually constituting each other within and beyond higher education is really key, I think, to our discussion of critical digital literacies. So Laura Czerniewicz wrote recently just about this and about how digital structures and practices are unevenly distributed and experienced widely within social structures. These are in turn refracted into universities, which then reproduce these structures and practices while knowledge production and dissemination shape and reframe those. So they're mutually constitutive. And then that brings us to really speaking about not just the what, but the why of critical digital literacies. And this is a recently published paper which was shared with me when I put out a request on Twitter saying I was going to speak about this topic here at AMICAL, and many scholars shared scholarly publications and resources, and that's what's in the Google Doc that I shared at the start. And this particular paper by Jennifer Ross and colleagues is really powerful, I think. And as you can see here, she talks about the need to understand power dynamics, inequalities, and oppressions at work in and through digital technologies. And these are really a precondition for educating fully literate, fully competent digital citizens and technology users. And perhaps, some of you who are already working in this area, that might resonate with you as well. So critical digital literacies, it's obviously very complex. There's not one definition of this, but I just want to highlight a number of connections with other concepts that I know you've been talking about at the conference and that many of you are working in. The concept, of course, is very contested, but I think a lot of the work that we're doing in all of these different types of literacies overlap in really fundamental and important ways. So when we talk about critical digital literacies, we really must acknowledge that it's not just the digital we're talking about, but the whole notion of digital literacies really was built on work that had already been done in information literacies and media literacies without question. So it's intricately interwoven with all of these other literacies. So the foundational definitions of digital literacies that arise out of these about the ability to use technology to find, evaluate, create, and communicate information, requiring both technical skills and kind of cognitive and relational capacities to do that effectively. That is all inherent in the definition of digital literacies that I am using. The critical aspect is, I suppose, key. And that is recognizing the need for developing our students' abilities to examine the digital world and focusing on issues of participation and power. So the use of critical here is, arises from critical theory and as is used in critical pedagogy, for example. So digital and data education are about skill and competence building, of course, but they also must be about knowledge of digital practices, understanding how power works within and through technology, as I mentioned before, securing and establishing digital identities, privacy, and so on. So critical digital literacies are about, knowing the world and having the ability to act upon the world, and really is an aspect of education for social change, I think. So there are a number of different ways that people have conceptualized critical digital literacies, and they don't always call it the same thing. So I love Emajulo and McGregor's conceptualization of radical digital citizenship, which is exactly what I have just described about as critical digital literacies. Individuals and groups committed to social justice critically analyze the consequences of digital technologies, and it's a foundation for citizenship in today's world. Another concept that's again closely rated is defined by Erin Glass. She uses the term critical technological consciousness about striving to uphold democratic principles. And in the second paragraph notes that it's a core responsibility of educational practices today. But one of the most recent kind of directions that critical digital literacy is moving and looking and acting is in this whole area of data literacies and algorithm literacies. So datafication is proceeding rapidly in society and within higher education. And just very simply, I would consider datafication as, tools designed to extract behavioral data and that translate into profit for the companies that design the tools. It's an emerging trend, and it is a new phase of our work as educator and increasing. So there's an enormous selection of work over recent years focusing on how digitization and datafication exacerbate inequality. These are just a few of them. I will note that all of these, there are links to all of these in the Google Doc that I shared, but in the slides, I've tried always to link to open sources so that if you don't have the books, I just have Wikipedia links on the slide so that you can, if you don't happen to have the book, that you can still get a summary or a sense of it, and then perhaps decide if you want to read it. But Sophia Noble looked in algorithms of expression, looked at how we must understand that search engines are not neutral, that they actually privilege whiteness and maleness. Ruha Benjamin shows how, again, seemingly neutral algorithms and big data applications replicate and worsen racial bias. Kathy O'Neill in Weapons of Math Destruction, WMD, again looks at big data and algorithms and shows how many of the decisions that are embedded in those algorithms amplify inequality in so many ways. And she actually uses the example of education, among many others, in her book. And data feminism is, again, packed with examples showing how intersectional feminism can help work towards justice. D'Ignazio and Klein publish 7 principles for data justice, which I'm actually using in my research fellowship at the moment. They're translatable to, to a number of fields. So I highly recommend that. And that book is available open source. So the systems we rely on, not only out in society, but the systems we rely on for scholarship and education are also digital and datafied, of course. And as many have described, higher education is permeated in data. So Helen Beetham and colleagues wrote a paper published just a few months ago, which addresses this, I think, really powerfully, and just talk about these 3 main ways that we can recognize surveillance practices in higher education. Student and educator activities are rendered as data, and then we go on to data analytics in various ways. Inequalities of power exist between data owners and the companies that are permeated through higher education and those whose data is being collected, students, faculty, and staff. And there's an intensification, particularly during the pandemic, of data-oriented digital platforms into higher education institutions. And this increasing normalization of vendor and university relationships, which are totally skewed to profit-making for the vendors. So quite simply, digital technologies have been embedded in our institutions for many years, but private companies have accelerated their entry into HE during the pandemic. We need only look at the example of online proctoring. And as Bonnie Stewart and Erica Lyons say, I think quite powerfully, whether we want to engage with data or not, our work both generates it and guides students into environments that mine it. So for ourselves and our professional development and for teaching our students, it's really important that we engage with developing critical digital literacies. So without, I have a question on the next slide, but without proposing to a definition of critical digital literacies, I will just extend this as an indicative description of what they are. Basically, capabilities to navigate technical tools and practices, interrogate digital multimedia texts, and design and create digital text. So those first 3 are what would be in most definitions. So, being able to use tools, read and interrogate things, and create them in digital form. But the last 3 are perhaps what I might focus on more today. Engaging with ethics, power structures, and inequalities attendant with digital technologies and having the confidence to do that. being able to create and revise our academic, public, and online identities on an ongoing basis, and cultivating a gentle capacity in this increasingly digitized and datafied world. So that's like the halfway point, but I just, it's probably a lot of information. And then the second half, I want to really share some examples, talk about work we did at the National Forum and other places. But I really want to listen to what you're saying and see what resonates for you and what your issues are. So if you'd be willing to maybe share a challenge you've experienced in regard to this whole notion of the digital and critical digital literacies. I'll have a look at the chat here. Demetrius, thank you for the link to Coded Bias. It's actually in the, I have a reference to it in the document. Thank you for that. It's in the document I shared. Yes, this overwhelm that we are already experiencing, and then understanding that this is so important, and how do we do that? Yeah. Turn it in. Coming to shared understanding across faculty from different departments and staff about what we mean by digital literacies. Yes. With students, what do they already know? What should I teach them? In other words, pre-assessment would be key to me, but it never happens. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for sharing these challenges. Getting administration on board. Getting commitment. Yes. Quite often we can expend a great deal of energy ourselves as educators, but without the commitment from administrators and things that are embedded in strategy and policy, they're not sustainable. So that's a big issue. Shared understandings. Yeah. Digital literacies of the administration. Absolutely. Not understanding the core competencies. Okay. I am going to keep an eye on the chat here, but I'll keep going because I am trying, I want to stay, I want to respect the time constraints that I have this morning. Admin make thoughtful conditions about it. Thank you. So if we understand that power acts in and through digital technologies in myriad ways, I think a key question is not whether we should include analysis of power and social inequalities in digital and data education, but how best we can facilitate those conversations and address some of the challenges, that you've raised this morning. So moving on from there, what I thought would be useful is to share some examples of work that people are doing to really develop critical digital and data literacies for faculty, for staff, for students. And there's kind of three areas that I find that are kind of arenas where people act, and that is pedagogy. A lot of the examples are around pedagogy. How do we teach students? But also policy, and also people point to the importance of procurement. So I'll speak about each of these and just share some examples, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So, and again, I was thinking a lot about this in preparing the keynote. The notion of, the importance of embedding initiatives that are sustainable is really important. So we need, resourcing, sustainability, commitment of leadership. So that's a challenge I'll try and talk to. So I will say before I go through some of these examples, some things to look out for. In a lot of these examples, partnership and cross collaboration, are key. So partnering with students, collaborating across disciplines, across functions, across institutions, across countries. And openness is used strategically quite often to achieve these aims, and also linking strategy, policy, and practice together. So those are just the three things to look out for. So I'll start briefly by talking about some examples from the National Forum. So the National Forum, as Maha said, is a very long name. The National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education. And I worked for 3 years. The National Forum works on a secondment basis. So most people work there for a period of time. So I worked there for 3 years as the digital and open education lead. The forum is quite unique. It works across all of the higher education institutions in Ireland, which are diverse institutions from, very small, a couple of hundred to almost 30,000, institutes of technology to large universities to small teaching colleges. Most higher education institutions in Ireland are publicly funded by the government. We don't have big, privately funded institutions. So that affects things, and that's why a government, centrally funded body like the National Forum can work effectively across the sector. So it only works. It's a small body. At most it would be 14 or 15 people, and quite often, many fewer than that. So the way that the National Forum works is by fostering collaboration. Always working and partnering with people, across these institutions. The forum provides structure and coherence to different efforts. It had, it organized a lot of funding calls around key themes, some of which were around digital and open education. It builds evidence to inform policy and practice, leverages research teaching linkages, works openly, and is responsive to evolving contexts. So some of what's the things that are developed are very targeted. So here are two examples of, as it says in the bottom left there, National Forum funded projects around the area of critical literacies. As with all National Forum funded projects, it must meet these two requirements. Anything that's funded by the National Forum had to be a cross-institutional initiative. So collaboration was built in, at least at the cross-institutional level, and quite often across disciplines as well. And also, to obtain National Forum funding, all resources published had to be openly licensed. They had to be shared as OER, so the whole Irish higher education sector could benefit from them. And these two things are really used strategically and have actually helped to develop open capabilities across the sector. So the Metro Map idea was developed about 6 years ago, actually, but has continued to be enhanced over time, something called All Aboard. And it's about developing digital literacies and digital capabilities for students and staff. And it was developed out of student and staff collaboration. DISCS is a professional development initiative about incorporating social justice principles into pedagogical practices. And I think this is really consequential for a couple of reasons. One is that so often when we talk about critical digital literacies, people focus on the digital and say, well, that's not really my area, that's not my strength or whatever. Whereas much of what's required to teach critical digital literacies uses existing teaching strategies from the humanities, the whole, critical pedagogy, developing critical mindsets, which are central to the humanities. And that's actually such a key strand of what critical digital literacies requires. So the DISCS resources, I think, are really useful in that respect. So again, key points here are collaboration, openness, and that it's not just about the digital, but enabling faculty to incorporate social justice principles into their teaching. So again, all those resources are developed, by professionals and students in Irish higher education for the Irish higher education sector. I'll shift over to policy now. There was a national sectoral consultation in Irish higher education that went on for about 2 years. It was delayed because of the pandemic, about the fact that many students and staff didn't feel involved in digital policy making. So there were all kinds of decisions about, are we doing lecture recording? Are we committed to creating open educational resources? All kinds of things around the digital, and students and staff largely didn't feel involved. So through a wide consultation and partnership, this guide was developed and published last November, and it defines something called enabling policies, and which focuses specifically on diverse, inclusive, and intentionally equitable policy and practices. It includes case studies, and it's of course published openly. So this is just one extract from the guide. I won't go into any more depth on it, but these are about any policy for digital and open teaching and learning. This is a kind of like a checklist of what people could work towards to make sure that those policies are enabling, so that they address an actual issue. They're integrated with higher education strategy and culture. The process is collaborative, marked by student-staff partnership, diverse, inclusive, and intentionally equitable. I will say that in Ireland, we don't use the word faculty. All staff are staff, whether they're academic staff or not. So when I say student and staff, that means, all who teach and all who learn. So this was key for building, this notion of partnership was key for building cross-institutional support. And as an example, one institution in Ireland shared that because they knew it was so important to embed policy in the university's mission and strategy, this is something that can ensure success for your policies. They actually intentionally worked during a new mission building process at the university to make sure that open was one of the 5 mission statements. So that because they knew they wanted to pin so many things that they knew were generative and supportive of critical digital approaches to the notion of openness. So we can be strategic about inputting into strategy, inputting into policy, and perhaps you have policies that could be used yourself to shore up your efforts in terms of pedagogy, in terms of policy, or in terms of procurement. Happy to talk more about that as well. A couple of other examples, not from the National Forum. This is a project called Understanding Data, Praxis, and Politics, about developing critical digital literacies. I encourage you to dig into that. There are modules for students, there are academic articles, there's a rubric, there are a wealth of resources there about, again, developing critical approaches to data specifically. That was only published last year. And I quote Chris Gilliard there because he has been doing this work for a long time. He doesn't have a pack of modules, but he blogs and he writes regularly in a number of places. And he is committed to bringing difficult conversations and difficult questions into the classroom about data, about racism, about inequality, about the digital and how all of these intersect. And he writes, I think in the article I've cited here, that he bristles when people talk about privacy being dead, because as he says, some of the people who have been deprived of privacy rights are the most aware of how important they are. So this notion of having meaningful conversations with students about these is so important and doesn't often need a lot of preparation, but just needs the commitment to do that, make those connections. This is a lovely student library faculty collaboration from the US, where students researched and designed and built this online resource called And Still We Rise, prominent Black political and cultural figures who had visited this institution, SUNY Plattsburgh, since the 1960s. And it was, they delved into library resources, they delved into online public resources, and they shared this open resource for the community and for the world, which basically centered Black life on campus, and also demonstrated the potential for curriculum and assignments that both further development of digital literacies and further racial justice. So again, another really meaningful approach. A couple of projects around co-creating open textbooks, again, leveraging open to develop digital literacies and work towards reducing inequality. The first example is from the Digital Open Textbooks for Development project from University of Cape Town, and is about empowering academics to build curricula in a more relevant fashion for their students. The second example, Sarah Lambert from Australia, is a project called Open Textbooks and Social Justice. And in that case, they're modifying open textbooks for local needs and to correct underrepresentation and misrepresentation. So again, this interweaving of the digital literacies of adapting an open textbook with the purposes of reducing inequality. Maha kindly shared, when I put the question out on Twitter, I had seen this resource, Maha, the Digital Literacies Toolkit, just recently published by AUC. But I was delighted that you shared it in the context of my trawl for resources for this keynote. Some of you maybe were at this workshop this morning. This is wonderful, this very, very concisely presented, really approachable, individual kind of lessons and assessment ideas for embedding digital literacies in teaching, co-created resources, context sensitive and open. So another really excellent example. all of these different examples, I think, are great if you're like an individual educator who wants to, who wants to further and develop critical digital literacies for yourself and for your students. But I think we all recognize that a collaborative systemic approach is really the key to success. So we can do the individual work, but we have to really zoom out and get the bird's eye view and really think about change systemically and change moving towards better futures. So a few, in analyzing a lot of these examples, thinking about my own work and the work of others, I just have a few final comments before I wrap up, and about embedding critical digital literacies in higher education. So it is really important that we engage with ethics, power structures, and inequalities, and that has to be interwoven in the work. The notion of it being collaborative across disciplines, across functions, across institutions. My experience with the National Forum shows that, if a notion of collaborativeness is tied to funding or tied to, the requirements for any program, that kicks off the collaboration, but then it just gets its own life. People create those relationships across. So, are there some ways that you could structure collaboration into some of the work that you're doing? Partnership and peer-to-peer learning. When faculty or staff find it difficult to be noisy enough to be heard, by the powers that be, quite often getting feedback and the voice of students involved can really, help lift it above the parapet and become more visible. So that's really important for student, faculty, staff cooperation and collaboration, but also for visibility as well. The importance of things being contextualized and situated in local context, strategic use of openness. So using open work that other people have created, like the examples I shared, but also sharing your own work openly really facilitates a lot of connections that can help you be more strategic in your own work. Integrating in the curriculum. And I cannot say enough about just embedding in policy, strategy, and culture. So if you are involved in individual initiatives around developing critical digital literacies, how can you embed that in policy, strategy, and culture in your institution is a really essential way for finding other allies, and again, for raising the visibility and your chance of success. So the after times, which I spoke about a few minutes ago, is about just mustering the courage and the energy to do this work. And I know we're all exhausted. So, collaborating with each other, all of us who are here, your kind of critical friends can sometimes embolden you and give you the energy to bring it beyond that. So, I certainly wish you the best in doing that. And there are so many reasons to feel overwhelmed. I feel them myself, and even to feel despair in the face of growing challenges, but we can be motivated by hope in the work of others. So I hope some of the examples perhaps inspired you today. And please share your own examples because you can inspire others. You may not even know who they are or where they are, but your work can certainly inspire others. And I'll just leave the last word to James Baldwin. As those of you who might know his work know, his love for humanity and his commitment for justice were forces that gave him the will to continue to hope. So I thank you and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was amazing and really inspiring, and you covered a lot in a very short amount of time. Folks, open for questions, getting a lot of applause. Feel free to raise your hand or type questions in the chat. Catherine, do you want to call on people as they ask questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Alex, oh no, that's applause. I thought that was a hand. Usually the upper left is a hand. I'll
ask a very quick question. Well, it's a quick question, might take a long answer. About, I really like the main features of enabling policies being collaborative and student and staff partnership. And I know you've been working on this for a while. And my question is, have you been involved in doing this staff-student collaboration across all of the different universities? Like, I'm just thinking about, because with AMICAL, Jeff, I keep trying to do things like that, and it feels like our funding doesn't go directly to student things. Mm-hmm. And so how do you involve students in those collaborations across institutions, and how does that work in terms of rewarding student time and things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Maha. And, it was definitely a learning process in the National Forum, because, quite often what happens even in the institutions and policy development is say, oh, we need student involvement. And so you get the head of the students union, and just sit them down in the meeting and they speak and, but are they speaking for all students? Can they speak for all students? All of that. So in the National Forum, from the time of its inception, there was a kind of a National Forum associates, which were representatives, staff, faculty, representatives from every institution in Ireland. But then we actually mirrored that with students as well. So there was an assembly of student associates. So again, there was at least one student associate from each institution, and they got a small stipend. And then there was a person in the National Forum who was the student success coordinator who convened that forum. So any of us who were working in the National Forum on anything could go to that assembly about anything and say, I'm working on this policy guide, would anyone like to be involved or whatever. So it was a coherent group, and that leveraged so much, because it took away that whole notion of how do we find students and so on. And students would commit for a year, an academic year. So it's something that I don't know if AMICAL could do, but really, when these things are set up, when you put the structures in place to set things up, what they spawn is usually much bigger than what you ever imagine, and that's what happened with that student assembly.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Catherine. Okay, Evie.
Hi.
Hello. Hi, Catherine. This was wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm a librarian, and I would like to ask you, it was wonderful content. My question is, how do we sensitize, continue to educate and engage our campuses and our communities around these ideas? So, because you obviously have huge experience around this, these matters. So how do we continue this conversation? How do we continue to learn and educate ourselves and others around these ideas? And that's my question. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And, it's a great question. And this work is, I won't pretend that I know, have a complete answer to that. It's continual work. But a few things really help. One, I think, is, if there's an initiative, usually you can find, a few people who are committed to this and you're working together on some initiative, a LibGuide or a project or a pedagogical initiative, and making it visible is often key. So making it visible, opening it first is one big step to making it visible. So if you openly license anything that you are doing in this area, share it. What very often happens is other people in the institution, but even more importantly, sometimes beyond your context, see it, relate to it, respond to it, or whatever. And that often gets the ball rolling, gets a snowball rolling. All you need is a few more people to find out about it, a few more people to embolden. And it's slow work, but I think the strategic use of openness and defining success not as converting everyone and making sure everyone knows about it, but just a few more, a few more here. One person from the senior management, committee, one dean, whatever the next step is. Because, like any social movement for change, if we can look at so many examples, if success was defined at, changing the world or changing the institution, people wouldn't have gotten out of bed in the morning. So it's just about that very next step, the very next person, and making sure that what you do is visible. I think that's key.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine.